September 27, 1939, marked the formal surrender of Warsaw to the German forces, signaling the end of organized resistance in the Polish capital and effectively concluding the military campaign in Poland. This day not only underscored the tragic end of Poland's valiant struggle against overwhelming odds, but also set the stage for the brutal occupation that would follow. The surrender of Warsaw was a pivotal moment in the early stages of World War II, revealing the brutal realities of Nazi occupation and prompting a wave of international reactions as the global community grappled with the implications of Poland's fall. The surrender of Warsaw, an end to the siege. After nearly a month of relentless bombardment, artillery fire, and ground assaults, the defenders of Warsaw could no longer hold out. On September 27, 1939, the Polish command, led by General Julius Rommel, who had assumed command in the final days of the siege, formally surrendered to the German forces. The surrender was not just a military capitulation, but a grim acknowledgement of the stark realities facing the city's defenders and its civilian population. The decision to surrender was reached after it became clear that continued resistance would only lead to more unnecessary deaths and destruction. Warsaw was a city in ruins. The German Luftwaffe had carried out extensive bombing raids, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Fires raged unchecked, and essential services like water, electricity, and sanitation were destroyed. The humanitarian crisis was profound, with tens of thousands of civilians killed and many more suffering from starvation, dehydration, and disease. The Polish defenders, a courageous mix of soldiers, militia, and civilians, were exhausted, their ranks decimated, and their resources depleted. As part of the surrender terms, the remaining Polish forces in Warsaw were to lay down their arms, and the city would come under full German control. The Germans, eager to avoid further casualties and to secure the city quickly, agreed to a cessation of hostilities in exchange for the surrender of all Polish military and paramilitary personnel. With this agreement, the last significant Polish stronghold in the west fell, marking a definitive end to organized resistance against the German invasion. The human cost, consequences of the siege. The aftermath of the siege was devastating. Warsaw, once a vibrant capital, was left in a state of near total destruction. The relentless German assault had not only targeted military positions but also civilian infrastructure, leading to widespread loss of life and suffering. Reports from the city described scenes of utter devastation. Streets filled with rubble, buildings reduced to hollow shells, and a civilian population traumatized by weeks of relentless bombardment and terror. The surrender brought a temporary halt to the violence, but for the residents of Warsaw, the end of the siege was just the beginning of a new ordeal. German occupation forces moved swiftly to establish control over the city, and the repression began almost immediately. The Gestapo, Germany's feared secret police, set up operations to root out any remaining resistance and to enforce Nazi rule. Civilians were subjected to arbitrary arrests, executions, and forced labor. For many, the choice was stark: comply with the occupiers' demands or face brutal reprisals. Among the most tragic consequences of the siege was the humanitarian crisis that ensued. Thousands of wounded civilians and soldiers filled makeshift hospitals that lacked adequate medical supplies and personnel. Food and clean water were in short supply, leading to starvation and outbreaks of disease. The destruction of infrastructure left many without shelter, forcing them to live in the ruins of their homes or in overcrowded shelters. The immediate task of the German authorities was to restore order and begin the process of consolidating their control over the newly conquered city. But this was to be achieved through a regime of terror and oppression. Soviet consolidation in eastern Poland, reinforcing occupation. While Warsaw fell to the Germans, the Soviet Union continued to consolidate its control over eastern Poland. Following the swift advance of the Red Army into the region after their invasion on September 17, Soviet authorities moved quickly to dismantle the existing political and social structures and replace them with Soviet governance. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, was instrumental in this effort, conducting mass arrests, deportations, and executions to eliminate any potential resistance and suppress nationalist sentiment. On September 27th, Soviet efforts to integrate eastern Poland into the Soviet state intensified. Local administrative bodies were dissolved, and Soviet officials were installed to oversee governance according to Soviet laws and policies. The NKVD expanded its operations, targeting anyone suspected of opposing Soviet rule or maintaining loyalties to the former Polish state. Thousands of Polish military officers, civil servants, intellectuals, and landowners were arrested and deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. The Soviet occupation was characterized by a brutal campaign to reshape Eastern Poland according to communist ideology. Agricultural collectivization was enforced, and industries were nationalized to align with Soviet economic policies. Schools were reorganized to teach Soviet propaganda, and religious institutions were either closed or heavily regulated by the state. For the local population, the Soviet occupation meant the loss of their national identity, accompanied by widespread fear, repression, and the dismantling of their cultural and social institutions. German occupation, establishing control and enforcing order. In the wake of Warsaw's surrender, the German occupation forces moved quickly to consolidate their control over the newly conquered territories in western Poland. With the Polish military neutralized and the capital under German authority, the Wehrmacht and Nazi officials focused on establishing a stable occupation regime that would serve both military and economic needs. This involved a combination of military presence, administrative restructuring, and economic exploitation. On September 27th, German authorities implemented a series of measures aimed at consolidating their control over Warsaw and the surrounding areas. Martial law was strictly enforced, and the Gestapo intensified its campaign of arrests and intimidation to suppress any remaining resistance. The occupation authorities targeted not only those suspected of resisting, but also the broader Polish intelligentsia and cultural leaders, whom they saw as potential threats to German rule. This strategy aimed to prevent the emergence of any organized resistance and to instill fear among the Polish population. The economic exploitation of the occupied territories also continued to ramp up. Forced labor was imposed on the Polish population, with thousands being deported to work in German factories, farms, and other industries essential to the Nazi war effort. The policy of Germanization involved the displacement of Polish populations and the settlement of ethnic Germans in their place, with the goal of creating a loyal German population in the newly acquired territories and erasing Polish cultural and national identity. German propaganda maintained a narrative of the invasion and occupation of Poland as necessary defensive actions to protect Germany from external threats and to secure its eastern borders. Allied response: strategic reassessment amidst escalating conflict. The fall of Warsaw and the complete occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces prompted a crisis of confidence among the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France. The rapid defeat of Poland highlighted the failures of Allied policy and underscored the urgent need to reassess their strategy in the face of a growing Axis threat. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government faced increasing criticism for its handling of the crisis. Public opinion was growing more vocal in its condemnation of the government's perceived failure to act decisively in defense of Poland, with many feeling that Britain had not fulfilled its obligations to its Polish ally. On September 27th, the British War Cabinet continued to debate potential responses, including the possibility of increasing military aid to other nations threatened by Axis aggression and expanding economic sanctions against both Germany and the Soviet Union. However, logistical challenges and concerns about military readiness continued to constrain the British response. The Royal Air Force (RAF) remained focused on defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany in an effort to weaken the Nazi war machine through economic attrition. The British government also explored ways to support Polish forces that had escaped to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive even as Poland itself fell under occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. The complete occupation of Poland forced France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause in an increasingly hostile environment. International reactions. diplomatic maneuvers, and strategic recalculations. The surrender of Warsaw and the continued occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 27, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 27, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 27, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the surrender of Warsaw and the firm establishment of Soviet control in eastern Poland with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 27, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the surrender of Warsaw and the continued consolidation of Soviet control over eastern Poland highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War. The events of this day underscored the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability.